Anyhow, I spoke at TechEd earlier this year, and I received a lot of feedback. Not a lot of feedback, but about 3 pieces of my feedback said I was taking too many drinks of water during the session. So I brought Mountain Dew this time instead of water. So hopefully that won't annoy people. Anyhow, you all might have seen me before. I just realized earlier today that I've been the first conference like this I spoke at was TechEd of '99 in Amsterdam, I think. So I've been doing this for almost 10 years now, which is a little bit scary. But my name's Tyler Robinson. I'm the lead program manager at Microsoft on the Windows application deployment team. My team owns both the Windows installer technology and the ClickOnce technology, plus a few other things that you're probably familiar with. Someone at the Ask the Experts last night pointed out to me that the title of the session is the exact same title that I used for my session at PDC 05. And so deploying your application with Windows Installer and ClickOnce. But I guarantee that the content is not the same. So what we're going to talk about today. I wanted to divide up the talk into sort of 2 distinct pieces. I wanted to talk about the recent releases that we have on both the ClickOnce side and the Windows Installer side that are available today, that are things that have just come out this summer, that I want to let you know what the new features are that we've done, what we're doing to sort of improve the application deployment experience today on Windows with the Windows Installer 4.5 release and the ClickOnce release in the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1. And then I'm going to kind of switch gears and start talking about Windows 7, talk about the changes that we're making there. We have a new version of the Windows Installer that's shipping in Windows 7, which is Windows Installer 5.0. And we're also enabling what we're calling per-user applications in Windows 7. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, what the benefits of that are, and how you can get benefit from that using the Windows Installer in Windows 7. And finally, we'll have time for question and answer. Since the session is being recorded, there's a microphone in the middle that people can come to ask questions at the end of the session. Or if you're not comfortable getting up in front of everybody and asking questions, I'll just be available afterwards also to answer some questions. So challenges with application deployment today. I think I started noticing this probably in probably around 2004, 2005, when I had a lot of people coming to me at TechEd saying things like, you know, hey, my company just bought another company, and they have a set of applications that we want to now tie together as a suite, but we don't want to, recreate the new the installation packages completely from scratch. We want sort of an easy way to put all that together. Or people said, we're have partnerships with other companies. We have more complex dependencies. We're deploying other packages with our application. And this whole way that the Windows installer is designed, where your application sort of ends at the boundary of your MSI package, wasn't working for a lot of people. And you had a lot of not particularly good experiences. If you look at, say, Visual Studio back in 2005, you had that bootstrapper that was put together that has all these steps essentially that it goes through, and it says, oh, okay, we're going to go install this prerequisite, and then reboot the computer, and install the next prerequisite, and then go down the checklist till you actually get to install the application. And ultimately, that's not a very good user experience, because if you get halfway through that checklist and something fails, you're kind of in this weird halfway installed state. Your computer could get messed up that way. Plus, it's kind of a jarring experience for users. And then when Vista came out, it became even more complex with UAC. So I remember downloading a popular music program when Vista first came out, and it had several dependencies. And when you would run the package to install it, it would pop a UAC prompt for every dependency that the application was installing. And this, of course, is a very sort of jarring experience, especially when UAC was new, where you had 3 or 4 or 5 UAC prompts popping during your installation process. So that's kind of the first point there about the increasingly complex installation packages. And we really wanted to do something in the Windows installer to make the process of sort of building more complex packages a little bit easier for the developer and actually provide a better user experience. One of the other things that we've commonly seen is there's more and more custom code that needs to be written in installation packages, either to manage bootstrappers or custom action code or all sorts of things. And that's obviously a thing that we want to cut down on, because not only is it bad, it requires more time in setup development, but it's something that decreases the reliability of packages over time. So we know that the more custom actions that your MSI package contains, the less likely it is that that package is going to be reliable over time. And finally, the tools in the platform that existed for doing this wasn't ideal for these more complex scenarios, that the platform really wasn't evolving as quickly as it should have. For the end user, I mentioned this, there's a sort of confusing end user experience that we've seen with installing prerequisites, multiple UAC prompts, et cetera, et cetera. One of the other common things you'll see is you install one application, but then you go to the add remove programs applet to uninstall it, and there's actually many entries in the add remove programs applet because there are actually multiple packages that are installed, so that's a confusing experience for users. You'll see very long installation times because the prerequisites that you're installing are very large and are not particularly optimized to install together and things like that. And I mentioned this previously with the example of installing multiple packages, but you'll have an incomplete uninstall or rollback experience where if your package fails, then you'll roll back halfway through, but that could ultimately result in your machine being in a bad state. So there's two technologies we came out with over the summer. You might be familiar with these if you pay attention to my team's blog, which I'll have a link to a little bit later. But we came out with the Windows Installer 4.5 release. This is a little bit different than most of our other releases because typically the Windows Installer ships in a new version of the OS or a new service pack, and then at that same time we ship a down-level release. Or in some cases, as in the case of Windows Vista, we didn't ship a down-level release at all. The Windows Installer 4.5 release is what we call completely out of band, meaning that it didn't ship with any sort of OS. So it's completely available on the download center, and it sort of relies on the same way that the Windows Installer version 1.0 and 2.0 were deployed, which is that it relies on application developers to get the Windows Installer either from their favorite authoring tool or directly from the download center, and then they redistribute that with their installation package. And some of the new functionality we're providing there allows you to handle multiple package installations better. You get a better, more flexible custom user experience. And there's also increased patching reliability features that we've added for these kind of new complex packages that we're allowing people to create. On the ClickOnce side, we have ClickOnce that came out in the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1. We've done a fair amount of work to increase the reach of ClickOnce. And what I mean by that is there were some scenarios that ClickOnce didn't handle particularly well for some type of applications that people were using. There were some limitations to the technology, and we tried to decrease some of those limitations to make it accessible to more people. There's a new smaller .NET Framework redistributable that's part of 3.5 SP1. You've probably heard of the .NET Client Profile, and that's a very important thing, and not just for ClickOnce, but for anybody who has to redistribute the .NET Framework, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And finally, there's a new tool available in beta that I'll show you that's designed to put together a bootstrapper that will better manage the prerequisites in the scenario where you're deploying a ClickOnce application. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Windows Installer 4.5. How many of you out there have actually looked at MSI 4.5 already? OK. Not a whole lot of you. That's good. That means you guys are hearing about this for the first time, so this is good. So what were our goals in Windows Installer 4.5? Well, our first goal was, as I mentioned before, is to improve the developer and end user experience when you're having a package consisting of multiple packages. We also wanted to reduce the need for setup.exe type bootstrappers. So we wanted to give people the ability to essentially take a lot of the logic that they would normally build into a bootstrapper that they might have to write by hand and actually put that into the MSI package itself. So you can actually double click on an MSI package and have it do a lot of fairly complex tasks that you would only be able to do from a bootstrapper before. And finally, we wanted to improve reliability in some more complex patching scenarios. There were scenarios that people were running into where they wanted to use some of our patching functionality or Delta patches, and they couldn't do that, specifically because of certain sort of uninstall scenarios that weren't handled particularly well. And we wanted to improve those scenarios to sort of increase the adoption of patching in the Windows installer. So what does this look like at a feature level? Well, we pretty much have four buckets of features that we've added. The first one is what we're calling the multiple package transaction. And that's the one that I'm going to talk about in more detail. But the multiple package transaction essentially gives you the ability to treat multiple MSI packages as a single package. So you get things like one UAC prompt, one reboot, one files in use dialog, one transaction set if you're installing, say, several packages or patches even, and you get to halfway through the transaction and one of those fails, it'll actually roll back the state to the beginning state. You can get one add remove programs entry. There's a lot of interesting functionality in there. And then there's also the embedded custom UI. Now the embedded custom UI is a little bit of a misleading name. The embedded custom UI essentially was designed initially so that we had had feedback from people about our external UI functionality. And they didn't like the external UI functionality because they had to write a separate setup.exe. It was fairly difficult to implement. So we wanted to provide an easier way to build richer custom UI into the Windows installer and actually do that without writing a separate setup.exe and actually build that directly into your MSI package. So it was originally designed for that. But one of the nice things that you can also do is you can really run any code from your embedded custom UI. It doesn't just need to be UI code. So one of the interesting things you can do is you can take the code that manages your transaction and actually embed that in the custom UI code, which then essentially gives you the ability to create a single MSI package that is launched as kind of the entry point to, dozens or, 2 or 3 or as many as you want MSI packages and patches and handle that all as one transaction from that MSI package. It also gives you the ability to do interesting things that you couldn't do before, such as hooking into parts of the UI sequence in the Windows installer that you previously couldn't hook into. One example is on repair. So if you're in the Windows installer and you wanted to automatically repair a component, there was no way to jump back into your custom UI to either do custom logic there or throw custom UI as part of the repair operation. And now you can do that with the embedded custom UI. A good example of that is, say, an application like Office 2007 that ships as a MUI version, and you've probably noticed this with Office. It has many, many, many MSI packages that makes up, what actually is ultimately Office on the machine. And if you ran into a scenario where the Windows installer, detected that one of those packages was actually broken, it would go through and repair that, but it would just repair that one package. And realistically, because multiple packages make up the whole product, you might actually want to repair those multiple packages. And the embedded custom UI gives you the ability to do that through the hooks that we provide. And then the next bucket is the patch uninstall improvements. These are really specific to people who are patching fairly complex products and really worry about the ability for people to sort of deploy patches and be able to reliably remove them without messing up anything else on the machine. There were 2 primary things that we did there. One was there wasn't an ability previously to do something like run a custom action on patch uninstall. So when you're installing a patch on the system, you might have custom action code. A good example of this is, say, you might have a patch that runs on the system that then needs to configure a database or an IIS server or something like that as part of the patch. And then when the patch gets removed, it needs to back out those changes from the SQL database or the IIS server. That was something that you previously couldn't do. We now enable that in Windows Installer 4.5. And one of the other things is we have a better handling of shared components. This is a fairly complex scenario to describe, but I'll do my best to describe it to you. Essentially what happened was that the Windows installer's view during patching of shared components on the system was just for the current product. So let's say you had, let's use, say, Office with Word and Excel and the spell checker component, right? So if you installed, say, Microsoft Word on the system and then you patched the spell checker component to a specific version, and then you went and you installed, and you also had Microsoft Excel on the system and you patched the Excel version of the shared component to a newer version, and then you went back and you uninstalled the patch for Word, it would actually down-rev the shared component to the version for Word, not taking into consideration the version that Excel needs on the system. So we've actually provided the ability to have what we're calling a global view during patch uninstall of shared components on the system, which is really logically how it should be, but it just wasn't realistically how our patch engine was designed. And finally, kind of a sub-bullet here, but still an important thing that I wanted to let a lot of people know about, is that as I mentioned before, we did not ship a down-level redistributable of the Windows Installer 4.0. And there were a fair number of features that were specific to Windows Vista in the Windows Installer 4.0, like our UAC features, the Restart Manager features. But there are also a number of other features that could actually go down level that weren't tied to the OS. For example, the automatic per-package logging that we made available, where you can have a custom action that will view the log of your package after the installation if there's a failure, or you can set logging to be turned on for a specific package all time, things like that. So the features that are not tied to the OS also got shipped in Windows Installer 4.5. So you'll see some of the Windows Installer 4.0 features for the first time available down level with Windows Installer 4.5. So let me talk about the multiple package transaction a little bit more and explain it. So you see here I have this sort of before Windows Installer 4.5 on the left and with Windows Installer 4.5 on the right. So previously, I had an external setup.exe bootstrapper that I would have to write. And I'd install product A on the system. And then afterwards, I'd install product B, even though the B is hidden there by the failure. And let's say I encounter a failure on the installation of product B. What would actually happen is product B would roll back. And then normally this is the case that the user's machine would just be left in this state, that they'd have either part of a suite or a dependency or, in worst case, part of an application available on the system. And it could potentially leave it in a state that the user might not be able to uninstall it. They might not be able to upgrade to a version. It can lead to a very bad user experience. In some cases, really diligent developers might write it such that if an error was detected, that it would automatically go back and uninstall the other things. But that's still not the same as rollback, because rollback will put you back into the state you were before the install happened. Uninstall will just remove the stuff that was added to the machine. So with Windows Installer 4.5, what we did is we essentially gave you the ability to create a single transaction that covers both of your products, or as many as you want, right? So I have package A, package B, I get a failure, and the transaction rolls back completely to the beginning of the whole thing. And let me go ahead and show that to you. What do you got? Number D. All right, so I have this demo that one of my developers put together called the Animal Kingdom demo. And it's a fairly simple example that illustrates really nicely what we can do with a multiple package transaction. So what you see here, oh, and by the way, this doesn't take advantage of the embedded UI functionality, so there actually is still a separate setup.exe for this. But for the purpose of this demo, it's easier to show how we have multiple packages here. We have the eagle, the kangaroo, the shark, and the tiger package. And over here is a directory that I have created already so that you can see what's going on as the installation is occurring. So I'm going to go ahead and run my setup. And you can see here that I have my kangaroo, my tiger, my eagle, and my shark. And I can go ahead and click the kangaroo installation. You'll see over here that's created the kangaroo directory. I can go ahead and install tiger, and it's going to go ahead and install tiger. Now, even though these have sort of separate progress bars and it seems like separate things are happening right now, it's still in one transaction as far as the Windows installer is concerned. So what I can go and do here is if I install eagle, and let's hit the cancel button, and that'll simulate a failure, and you'll see that all the directories there that were created were removed. So everything that I previously installed as part of that transaction is actually removed. Now, one of the other nice things with the Windows Installer 4.5 that this demo doesn't show is the fact that you can actually handle this with all one progress bar. You don't have to display multiple progress bars and things like that. So you can actually appear as one seamless thing to the end user. Now, let me go ahead and run this again, and let me show you one more thing. So I'm going to go ahead and install my kangaroo. Oops. My tiger. My eagle and my shark. I'm going to go ahead and hit finish. Now if I go to ARP, F5 on this one. Okay, it's right here. So you can see here that I have one entry in the Add Remove Programs applet for Animal Kingdom. And if I go ahead and position my windows a little bit better. If I go ahead and I hit uninstall for my Animal Kingdom application, it's going to actually throw back the custom UI that I had. And it's going to display one progress bar as it removes all the Animal Kingdom components on the system. So again, the user doesn't have to go through and say, I want to remove each individual component separately. And of course, it can be, this takes advantage of our custom UI. So obviously, it can be, more complex than this, right? I could throw up a UI that says, what pieces of Animal Kingdom do you want to uninstall, and allow the user to select those options before actually performing the uninstall. But in this particular case, I'm just doing something very basic. I'm uninstalling the individual components. And you can see here that the pieces are getting removed as I'm performing the uninstall. So this is, just a very basic demo. It has some flashy UI in it, but at a basic level, it's very simple. There's only a few extra API calls that you actually need to make as part of your Bootstrapper to actually take advantage of the multiple package transaction. So let me keep that open. All right. So how to use that? Now, as I mentioned, there's only a few basic API calls that you need to make. Essentially, right now, if you're using a Bootstrapper, you're probably doing one of two things. You're either calling the MSI command line, essentially, and going through and saying, install this package, install this package, install this package. Or you're using our API calls like MSI install product, MSI apply patch, or MSI apply patches to actually install your package. All you need to do now is you just bracket all those commands in your Bootstrapper with an MSI begin transaction and an MSI end transaction. That's all you need to do. And that will give you the basic transaction functionality. And there was actually another demo I was going to use. It didn't work very well during the dry runs that I had because it wasn't a particularly good demo, but I actually had a demo that I was going to use that showed how you can take a very basic Bootstrapper and take the experience and add the MSI begin transaction and end transaction to it and actually show how the transaction works there. But it's so simple that there's really no reason to actually show the code for it in this particular case. And again, one of the other things that you can do is you can use the new embedded UI functionality. This is a little bit more advanced, but what you can do is you can use the new embedded UI functionality to actually go through and add the logic, add the begin transaction, end transaction, and installation APIs into an actual MSI package that someone launches. So instead of putting it in an external setup.exe, you can use the embedded UI. And how that actually works, by the way, it's not particularly complex. It works a whole lot like our external UI, but instead you take that code and put it in a DLL. You embed that DLL in your MSI package, and then there's a new MSI embedded UI table that you load with your DLL, and then that DLL gets called to process the UI as opposed to our internal UI. There's also, again, I'll give a link to our blog at the end of the session, but there are several posts made by some of our developers on the blog that go into more detail about how to take advantage of the multiple package transaction, how to take advantage of the embedded UI. So let's say you want to use Windows Installer 4.5. How do you go about that? I mentioned it's available as a redistributable. It's on the Microsoft Download Center. Both the redistributable and the SDK are separately available on the Download Center, so you don't have to download the whole Windows SDK to get the Windows Installer SDK. I know that's a popular decision with a whole lot of people, and we're going to try to keep that moving forward. But you essentially, it's available for Windows XP, SP2 and SP3, and also the 64-bit editions. It's available for Windows Server 2003 SP2, Windows Vista RTM and SP1, and Windows Server 2008. Future service packs of the OS should include Windows Installer 4.5. That's the plan going forward. So for example, the next service pack of Windows Vista and Windows Server 2008 should actually have Windows Installer 4.5 in it as opposed to Windows Installer 3.1, which Windows Installer 4.0, which they have today. So on up-level systems, you won't need to redistribute the Windows Installer 4.5. And keeping with something that we started in Windows Installer 4.0, in order to decrease application compatibility impact, because one thing I've learned going to these shows is there's always, I was just talking to my coworker Elsie about this, you're always going to find people are using your technology in new and interesting ways that you were never planning on them using it that way. So to reduce application compatibility impact, all of the new features and functionalities are opt-in. So if you take a Windows installer package that you have today, install Windows Installer 4.5 on the system and run it, it should run exactly the same as it runs today, unless you use the new properties or the new APIs or the new tables or the new standard actions, and then those will actually go ahead and kick in and bring up the new functionality for you. And also popular authoring tools support Windows Installer 4.5 today. There's a number of them. There's information in our SDK about where to go to get authoring tools, but all the major authoring tools support Windows Installer 4.5 today. So there's really no reason why you shouldn't go ahead and start looking at this new functionality in 4.5, especially if you have a scenario where you're going to be installing multiple packages or handling dependencies. So let me go ahead and switch gears here a little bit and talk about ClickOnce and the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1. So just like with the Windows Installer 4.5, I wanted to start out with a few of our goals for ClickOnce. One of our primary goals was to reduce barriers for developers wanting to adopt ClickOnce. There were some cases that, kind of low-hanging fruit that we wanted to make ClickOnce usable by a lot more people. Give you an example. One of the things was that ClickOnce used to only be able to be used through Internet Explorer. So we wanted to sort of open that up to any type of web browser that you want. So we added support in ClickOnce to support third-party web browsers via various plugins. So you're not sort of tied to IE by using ClickOnce. And there were a few other things that we did, opening up to new type of files, adding file association functionality, and some other things that I'll talk about a little bit later. One of the other things is we realized that the experience, and I have an example of this here in a minute, but the experience of actually installing prerequisites with your ClickOnce application is far from ideal, and we really wanted to improve that. Obviously, the most common prerequisite that you're going to have is the .NET Framework, but there's several other components that you might want to install with your ClickOnce application, and we really wanted to do some work to really improve that scenario. And finally, we had heard a big pain point, especially on Windows XP, is redistributing the .NET Framework. We want to reduce the amount of time and the number of clicks that it takes to redistribute the .NET Framework with your application, both from a developer side and from an end user side. And I'll talk about that a lot more in detail coming up. So what are the features that we added in ClickOnce in .NET 3.5 SP1? The first one is the .NET Client Profile Deployment Experience. Have you all heard about the .NET 3.5 Client Profile yet? Anybody? Okay, only a few. Okay, good. Excellent. I'm not repeating information that people have already heard. So I'll spend some time talking about that. But the .NET Client Profile is a smaller, lighter version of the .NET Framework that's targeted at client applications that should be easier to deploy with your client applications. I mentioned we added support for third-party web browsers. We also relaxed our signing requirements. We had received a lot of feedback from people that the requirement where you had to sort of sign your deployment manifest and some other things were creating it complex, creating additional complexity if I was, say, creating a ClickOnce app that I was passing off to, say, some company to deploy internally, and they wanted to customize that ClickOnce app, but they needed the same certificate that I signed my ClickOnce app, and obviously it's difficult for me to give that to them, or sometimes impossible. So we relaxed those signing requirements a little bit to make it easier for people to sort of customize ClickOnce applications for deployment. And one of the other things that seems like a fairly basic thing was we're now allowing you to associate file extensions with a ClickOnce application. So previously there was no way to say if my ClickOnce application saved a certain file on the system to make sure that when that file is double-clicked on that it's opened back up at my ClickOnce application. Shouldn't say there was no way. There was no easy way to do it. And now we've built in functionality in the ClickOnce to support file extensions, which was kind of a basic need for a lot of applications that were using ClickOnce. So let me talk a little bit about the .NET Client Profile. For those of you who have deployed the .NET Framework before, you know the problem here, right? The .NET Framework 3.5 SP1 installer, depending on what version you're installing and what platform you need to install it on, is anywhere from 400 to 200 megabytes in size. So it takes a real long time to install. If you're developing just a client application, the .NET Framework contains a lot of assemblies that aren't really required for your application. Maybe they're good for web apps or servers or things like that, but just for a client application, it contains a lot of stuff that you don't actually need, so there's a lot of bloat in there. And the user experience for installing the .NET Framework and other dependencies, either with your ClickOnce app or any app you're deploying, whether you're using ClickOnce or MSI or some other technology, was certainly not ideal. So the solution that the Windows Presentation Foundation team came up with was the .NET Client Profile. The .NET Client Profile is a 27 megabyte version of the .NET Framework. It contains only the assemblies that are deemed sort of necessary for client applications to install. And if you actually go there, I'll show you a web page here in a minute that has sort of an FAQ on the client profile, and you can sort of get more information about it there, about which assemblies are there and which aren't. And there's an improved deployment experience through a set of tools that they've produced. There's a bootstrapper that they've produced and some developer tools that actually make it a more compelling experience to actually install the .NET Framework and other dependencies with your application. And I'll actually show a demo of that in a moment. So just so that all of you know, in case you haven't had this experience before, and I hadn't actually seen this experience in this light until one of my program managers actually showed it to me. But before the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1, the ClickOnce experience of deploying your ClickOnce app with a set of dependencies is really complex. The first thing that you do is you get this web page that you've created, and this is just a web page that Visual Studio spits out. And I know this is really small, but essentially this says, hey, I'm installing my ClickOnce application, but you need to install the .NET Framework on the system first, and you need to install Crystal Reports on your system. So I say, OK, let me go ahead and click the Install button. And I go ahead and I install the .NET Framework, which is a completely separate installation experience that I go through. I get the IE dialog and UAC prompts and all sorts of other stuff that I'm going to get. So I get done installing the .NET Framework, and I get back to the first web page, except it says, you have to install Crystal Reports now. And for Crystal Reports, it actually, when I click the Install button, it actually sends me off to a web page where I have to go ahead and download and install Crystal Reports. And then after I do that experience, then I'm back to the web page again, where I can actually finally install my ClickOnce application, and it goes through the whole familiar ClickOnce installation experience. Now, obviously, this isn't living up to the promise of ClickOnce, and this was a scenario sort of sort of begging to be improved. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what we're calling the Client Profile Configuration Designer, which is available as a beta release today. It just got released yesterday or the day before, so you might have not heard about it yet. But let me go ahead and jump over to, where's it at? I think it's E. No. B. OK. So I've already installed the Client Profile Designer on here, and I'm not actually going to go ahead and build a whole project, but I just kind of want to show you kind of the basics of it a little bit. Now, the Client Profile Configuration Designer is essentially a tool that allows you to create a customized bootstrapper for any sort of application. It's not tied specifically to ClickOnce. It's not tied specifically to something you're building inside of Visual Studio. It's a separate standalone tool at this point. But what I can go ahead and do here is go ahead and, oops, don't do that. So let me just go ahead and give it a fake name here and start off with a new project. And there are a whole bunch of really interesting things you can do in here. You can create a completely sort of customized UI experience sort of from scratch in here. But one of the important things that I wanted to point out to you is this ability here on the left where it says Setup Package. And one of the first things it has this prerequisites item here. And there are a set of sort of preloaded prerequisites. There'll be additional ones that get added over time. But I can essentially say I want to target the .NET Framework client profile, for example. And I can add that to my package if I want to. And you can see it's over here, appears in the list. And if I have multiple prerequisites here, I could change the installation order. It does things like gracefully handles reboots and stuff. So for example, I can choose to defer the reboots until the end of the installation or until a certain point, or I can handle reboots in the middle of the installation, and when it reboots the system, it'll come back and start over where it left off. And then one of the other interesting cool things here is, if I have something that's not a predefined prerequisite, but I want to go ahead and install it, I can go ahead and add installers, right? So I can add a Windows installer package, just a regular setup.exe, ClickOnce package, or just sort of a loose files, maybe a script or something like that. So that really gives me a very a great ability to sort of chain a whole bunch of stuff together, and it provides a really nice, seamless end-user experience. Now, I'm not going to go through all this, but there's essentially sort of predefined UI that exists for your EULA and the setup progress and all these sort of things that are going on. And then once you build your package, I'll go ahead and show you an example here. There's a package that was built with this by the UX team over in the Windows Presentation Foundation. It's an example package called Photo Suru. And I'm just going to go ahead and double-click on the setup.exe here. And I go ahead and I get sort of this my EULA dialog, this custom UI that sort of I've built inside of the tool here. And I'm going to go ahead and hit Accept on the EULA, and it's going to display sort of one progress bar. Now, what you don't see that's going on here is actually it's installing sort of multiple applications at the same time. So it's installing something called the Sync Center down here, which has already been added. It goes ahead and it installs some extensions, and it goes ahead and installs a ClickOnce application, as well as the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1. Now for this demo, I had the .NET Framework on the system already, because obviously that would take a while to install. But you can see that there was just sort of one experience there, and it actually launched my application. Now if I go to the uninstall, the add remove programs applet, you'll actually see here that it actually installed several things. So we installed the subscription center here, Photo Suru, the desktop add-on, and I think those are the only things that it sort of added here as part of this installation. So it actually installed several things, again, in addition to the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1, but that was sort of handled from sort of one experience, and it wasn't jarring to the end user. Now, one of the other options that you can do that this doesn't take advantage of, obviously, is that there's multiple entries in the Add Remove Programs applet for each one of these, because depending on how you're installing your dependencies, you might want them handled as one, you might want them handled as many. But you could also design it so that instead of making these multiple entries in the Add Remove Programs applet, it would just have one and pop back into your UI for uninstall. So that is, as I mentioned, that's available today. And if I go over to laptop, I can actually show you here. If you go to windowsclient.net/WPF, you can see here there's a client profile configuration designer overview that just became available. That's where you can actually go to download it. They have several walkthroughs available where you can sort of walk through how to use the client profile configuration designer. And there's also a number of FAQs about the .NET client profile. So I highly encourage you to go ahead and visit the windowsclient.net/WPF to sort of learn more about this tool, learn more about the .NET client profile, and go ahead and use this. And as I mentioned, the tool is in beta today. I don't know what the release date is for it. There's not one set, but the beta version is available now. We're doing on time. Oh, we're doing great on time. Excellent. All right. So if you want to use the .NET Client profile, how do you go about using that? Well, the first thing is it's supported in .NET. It's supported in all Visual Studio 2008 editions, so you have to have Visual Studio 2008. And essentially, there's a project property that you can set on your project that says, hey, I'm targeting the .NET Client profile. If you go ahead and target the .NET Client profile, it's going to do several things. The first thing is that the build system will be configured in such a way that it'll check to make sure you're not trying to reference assemblies that aren't available in the .NET Client profile. And if you do, it'll throw you warnings and such to let you know that. And the other thing is that there will be application configuration files created on the system such that when the application is run, it's actually being run against the .NET Client profile on the system. And again, I mentioned the .NET Client Profile configuration designer that I just showed. It's available today in beta. It gives you sort of a seamless way to integrate your ClickOnce application or your MSI application with a series of dependencies. And that's available, again, today from windowsclient.net/WPF. So let's review a little bit now. I'm going to have some Mountain Dew. I haven't had some for the first part of this talk, so. So let's go back to sort of the challenges with application deployment today. Make sure I sort of covered everything. I talked about the increasing complexity with application deployment packages and how both the Windows Installer 4.5 and ClickOnce and .NET 3.5 SP1 with the client profile configuration designer can actually go ahead and help you sort of manage that complexity a little bit better. Maybe hide that complexity from your end users, or maybe you could make it easier for you as a developer to sort of design and install these packages. I talked a little bit about how both the Windows Installer, in the Windows Installer 4.5, how you can sort of reduce the amount of custom code by sort of getting rid of setup.exe custom actions, setup.exe bootstrappers, and writing that code directly into your MSI package, and making that a lot easier with the multi-package transaction functionality we have and the embedded UI functionality we have. And I talked about sort of these new tools that are available and how the platform for both ClickOnce and the Windows Installer are sort of evolving to sort of help manage these new scenarios. Talked about how both the Windows Installer 4.5 and also ClickOnce in 3.5 SP1 sort of help you deliver a sort of more consistent user experience when you're installing these more complex packages. How the installation times are actually shortened, especially with the new .NET client profile. And finally, how Windows Installer 4.5 helps you sort of manage your multiple packages in such a way that you're not going to have sort of an incomplete uninstall and rollback experience. You know, one of the things I forgot to mention in the confusing user experience piece was UAC. And one of the things that you probably noticed during my 4.5 demo, but I didn't really highlight it a whole lot, is the fact that because the multiple package transaction handles multiple packages as one piece, you actually only see one UAC prompt for both install and uninstall. And there's another thing that I meant to point out to you, but I'll go back to it when I get to my Windows 7 piece of the talk, and I'll go jump back into the demo, because I forgot to point out to you one of the, probably it's a very small thing we did in Windows 7, but I think it makes a lot of people happy. So we're kind of at the halfway point of my talk. I think I'm doing okay on time here. So I kind of want to go back and review kind of the takeaways from this first part of the talk. First of all, Windows Installer 4.5 and ClickOnce, they're all available today. And you should look into using them to improve your application deployment experience today. They're both available from the Download Center. Again, the Client Profile Configuration Designer is available from the website. And popular authoring tools support all these technologies today. So there's really no reason why you shouldn't look at these today. So let me switch gears a little bit and talk about Windows 7. So and talk about improving tomorrow's experience a little bit. So there are kind of two big topics I want to talk about in Windows 7. But before I get into that, I want to mention that all these technologies that you've heard about, the Windows Installer 4.5 features, they're obviously available in Windows 7. So if you're creating an application that's targeting Windows 7 and you're going to install it on Windows 7, you don't need to worry about redistributing the Windows Installer 4.5 on Windows 7. It's already there. Same thing with the .NET Framework 3.5 SP1. The .NET Framework 3.5 SP1, the full version, is going to be in Windows 7 in the platform, so you don't have to worry about redistributing that on Windows 7. So that's one of the great, sort of initial benefits you get out of Windows 7 is a lot of these things that you have to redistribute down level, you don't have to worry about redistributing on Windows 7. So that reduces complexity for authoring things for Windows 7. So in addition to that, on the Windows installer in Windows 7, I know you probably, if you've been to a lot of the Windows 7 talks, you've probably heard about the performance improvements we've made in Windows 7. Well, the Windows installer picks up on some of those performance improvements. We also made performance improvements ourselves. So you're going to see a lot faster installation times on Windows 7 than on down-level OSs. We also did some work to increase reliability of the Windows installer on Windows 7. And we also wanted to support what we call offline operations. This is something more targeted at system administrators, but after Windows Vista came out, there was a lot of pickup of essentially imaging machines using the WIM functionality that we had in Windows Vista. And system administrators wanted the ability to sort of work with applications in offline images. So if I have a WIM of Windows Vista, the only way that I could sort of inspect that WIM to see what applications were installed on it, what versions of applications, if it needed patching, would be actually to boot into that WIM and then perform the MSI operations against that. And it turns out this is a really inefficient experience, especially if you have in some cases, thousands of images that you're managing. You don't want to have to boot into each one of those on a regular basis to inventory things. So we actually provided the ability to, instead of booting into the image, you can actually go to the image and do some limited MSI operations on the image. And those operations are inventorying the image and also running our patch applicability checks. And we've also enabled per-user applications in Windows 7. This is an interesting topic. This is something that MSI has done for a long time. The Windows installer has sort of, always offered that option that says only install for me or install for everybody on the machine. But as the concept of security boundaries and stuff evolved, the Windows installer really didn't keep up with that. So even though I was only installing for me, I still would get a UAC prompt. The application would still get installed to the program files directory. It would still impact other users on the system. It's just that the entry points were only visible to me. So we wanted to do work to actually bring MSI and the whole Windows platform up to snuff with this idea that, well, I should be able to create an application that doesn't require a UAC prompt to install, doesn't require a UAC prompt to run, and is isolated to the user's profile in such a way that I don't need to worry about it affecting other users on the system. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And that's probably one of the big things we've done in the Windows installer and Windows 7 as a whole. So the goals of the Windows installer in Windows 7. The first thing was to minimize application compatibility impact. I spent a lot of time talking to people during Windows Vista about the app compat impact of some of the things we did in Windows Vista. And it wasn't specifically with just a Windows installer. There was a lot of UAC and things like that really messed up people's installations. So one of the primary things we wanted to do in Windows 7 is we really wanted to have minimal application compatibility impact. So I talked previously about this idea that, well, we want to make new features opt-in, but in addition to that, it should be more than that. It should be that if your application installs and runs on Windows Vista, it should just install and run on Windows 7. And you all are getting your Windows 7 bits here today at the show. So you should be able to go back and try it out and check that out and make sure that it's actually true. And if it's not true, then we should work with the application compatibility people to make sure it is. But I've been running Windows 7 on my laptop for, gosh, I think 4 or 5 months now. And I've had very few problems with application impact or things not installing or not running as I'd expected that did work on Windows Vista. We also wanted to reduce the need for custom action code. I mentioned this is kind of one of the things we wanted to do in Windows Installer 4.5. We wanted to continue that with Windows 7. We wanted to look at things that people were commonly writing custom actions for and see if we can go ahead and sort of reduce the need of that on Windows 7. I mentioned the performance and reliability previously. And we wanted to reduce the need for install time elevation and even runtime elevation, and that's through the per user application that I'll talk about later. Sorry. So features. First of all, you sort of get these out-of-the-box performance increases. You don't have to do anything, and you'll see up to 20. We actually saw up to 20% improvement for large installers. And by large installers, we used, I think the two ones that provided the most improvement were Visual Studio 2005 and also Office 2003. And we saw upwards of, I think it was like 23% for improvement in install time and patching time on these type of applications. So obviously the larger your install is, the more dramatic your performance improvements are likely to be. And it's across the board. It's not just install, it's install, uninstall, repair, and patching. And we also provided a more consistent UAC experience. And this is the thing. I'm going to actually go ahead and jump back into the demo because I missed something that I wanted to show you guys with my Animal Kingdom demo. So let me go ahead and thank you for activating Windows. OK. Go ahead and run through this and install it really quick again. Because I don't know the number of times I've heard about this from people. OK, so I've gone ahead and installed all my pieces of my Animal Kingdom application here. Let me go back to ARP and go ahead and refresh it. And sorry I didn't point this out before, but this is something fairly important. So if I go ahead and hit uninstall, what you doing here? Well, never mind, I can't show it to you. What I was going to go ahead and show you was the fact that when you uninstall from, let me try it one more time here and see what's going on. Confused by something. Anyhow, what I was going to show you was the fact that on uninstall, we actually display the proper UAC dialog now. So if you recall on Vista, if you had, it's OK, you can go ahead and clap. I saw one person clapping over there. If you had your MSI package signed on Windows Vista, the nice friendly, I call it the friendly happy UAC dialog would display on installation, but on uninstall for a number of architectural reasons, we weren't able to access the certificate. And so you got the sort of scary red UAC dialog on uninstall. And on Windows 7, we've actually fix that so that you actually get the appropriate UAC dialog on uninstall and install as well. Sorry I couldn't show that to you, but something that wasn't planned as part of the demo. And that's why I want to talk about the more consistent UAC experience here. So proper elevation prompt on uninstall, as I just mentioned. One of the other things, there were a few UI flows in our standard UI that gave sort of misleading elevation shields. There were places where you might hit a button and it had an elevation shield on it, but then there wouldn't be a UAC prompt followed on it depending on what mode you were running in and various other things. And we heard that that was confusing to people, so we redesigned some of the UI flows in such a way that if there is an elevation shield displayed, then you will actually get a UAC prompt after that. We've also went ahead and added some new actions and also enhanced some of our standard actions. The two standard actions that we improved, and again, this is to sort of get rid of, try to reduce the need for custom action code. But we saw a lot of people writing custom actions for lock permissions and service configuration. And these are standard functionality that's available in the Windows installer, but haven't really been refreshed since, say, Windows Installer 2.0. And there were people needing to do things that our standard action functionality couldn't do, and therefore they were writing custom action code, and that's just extra work that people shouldn't have to do if it's already built-in functionality in the Windows installer. So I actually took a look at the lock permissions functionality and the service configuration functionality, and added support for the things that people were writing custom actions for, and actually baked that into our standard action functionality. So you sort of get an improved experience there. We also wanted to improve the UI a little bit. There were people who were writing sort of lots of custom UI code for things that really should sort of be handled natively in our UI. One of them is that you never used to be able to have a hyperlink before in our native UI. So if you wanted to have a place in the UI, it says click here, it'll go off to a web page or something. There was just no way to do that in our native UI. So we added support for that, a fairly basic thing. And we also added a EULA print button, which you might think is something that's not that big of a deal. But we actually had a lot of customers coming to us and saying, hey, printing to EULA is a complex thing. We have to write a whole bunch of custom code for it. One of my developers showed me the custom action code that's in Wix that adds the EULA print button, and it's like hundreds of lines of code to do this. So we built that into our basic UI. So hopefully that'll sort of reduce the need for some custom action code to be written, moving forward. So those are the things we focused on there. And finally, I talked about the offline inventory and patch applicability checks. I don't need to go into it in more detail here. So let me go ahead and move forward with the per-user application scenarios. So first of all, what is a per-user application? Per-user application is something that's it's isolated to the user's profile. It's only visible to the user for whom it's installed. And not only visible, but it's only sort of accessible by that user generically, right? It's something that doesn't require elevation. You're not going to get a UAC prompt at install, uninstall, servicing. You're not going to get a UAC prompt at runtime. And that really keeps it isolated to the user's profile. It also keeps it from sort of impacting other applications on the system besides the applications that user is running. And like I mentioned, there's no machine impactful changes. So this kind of restricts how you can use a per-user application. You can't do things like install services or drivers or GAC assemblies. But for those of you who are familiar with ClickOnce, you're already sort of familiar with the sort of per-user installation genre of application. So what are our benefits of per-user applications? Well, if you drop them into two buckets, on the developer side, it gives you more flexibility in deployment scenarios, right? I don't have to think about UAC prompting or sort of, machine-wide changes and things like that. So it becomes sort of easier to develop an installation package for my application. On the end user side, if you think about UAC and like IE and stuff like that, I think you'll look at the fact that, if I want to grab download an application from IE and go through the process of installing that onto Windows, there's a whole bunch of dialogues that come up that, are kind of scary to people. That they say, oh, warning, you're about to install something on your machine. Warning, are you sure you want to do this? Warning, are you sure you want to do this? With per-user applications, you're not getting some of those prompts, so the user sort of feels more in control. They're less apprehensive about installing a new application on their system or uninstalling the application, because they can sort of feel more confident about these per-user applications because they're less likely to sort of cause sort of machine-wide damage that other applications potentially could. And obviously that's something that comes with over time, but we think it's something that people will learn as sort of these more per-user applications appear on the system. And this is something a lot of people have asked us for at shows and such, where they said, hey, we really want to avoid the UAC prompts because our customers are telling us this is sort of a scary experience, that they don't want to install our application because of UAC. So, what can you build into the platform that will sort of enable us to write an application that doesn't make these machine-wide changes? So what are the challenges with authoring per-user applications today? Well, first of all, there's a really lack of cohesive guidance for developers for creating per-user applications. I mentioned that ClickOnce is sort of a per-user deployment scenario, but it's not really clear to people, what can I do as a per-user application versus a machine-wide application and what I can't do. So there's not really any guidance there to tell people. In addition, we added new functionality in Windows Vista in the Windows installer that allowed you to create an MSI package that didn't require elevation, but yet we didn't provide any guidance for things like, well, if I'm not elevating, where do I install my application to? I can't install it to program files. Where do I put it? Right? So there was nothing that existed there. So we wanted to fix that in Windows 7. That goes into my next point, that developer normally authors their application to install the program files. Because program files is a machine-wide location, it's going to require administrative privileges to install in the system. There was no predefined sort of per-user install location for the bits. And as a result, people who were trying to create per-user installations, there was no consistency there. They might install it to my documents and settings. They might install it to some of the local app data location. There was no consistent place, so these applications would sort of get sprayed all over the system. And there were several of them that came out after Vista. And finally, while we made a lot of changes in Vista to allow sort of OS registration points to be per-user, there was like a very limited consistency on how you would use those OS registration points and how they were documented. And there wasn't good documentation on how to use those. So we wanted to improve that in Windows 7 as well. So specifically to the Windows installer, you sort of have this evolution of per-user applications that I talked about. The first thing is that prior to Windows Vista, you would sort of create a single MSI package, and that had the option install for me or install to everyone on the system. This was sort of part of the default UI flow of sort of every installation tool out there. And while that was sort of a clear thing to the end user, it didn't really divide it on security boundaries at all. It just, if I selected install only for me, I would go ahead and create the shortcuts and the other entry points just for that user, but the application would still get installed to program files. On Vista, it would still require an elevation prompt, and a lot of people were confused by that. They're like, well, if I'm only installing for me, then why does it require elevation? And then on Vista, we introduced this functionality to mark a package as not requiring elevation, that you could explicitly author an MSI package that says, I don't require elevation. But the problem with that, again, besides the other problems of not knowing where to install, you couldn't create a single package that installed both per user and per machine like the previous experience. You would have to say, I have a per user package that's designed to install per user. I have a per machine package that's designed to install per machine. And either the user needs to choose which package they want to install, or I'd have to write a setup external setup.exe bootstrapper that would go ahead and offer that option to the user and then run the appropriate package. Similar to what you experience with, say, 64-bit packages on the Windows installer as well. So the improvements we're making in Windows 7. So I have two slides here. One that talks about the improvements in Windows 7, and then the improvements specifically for the Windows installer. First of all, we're going to have documented guidelines for creating a per-user application. Guidelines about which extension points you can use, how to use Windows installer to install a per-user application, how to use ClickOnce to install a per-user application, which technology is appropriate for whichever scenarios. The other thing that we've done is we've created support for per-user program files and common files, as well as some other locations, but the program files and common files are probably the most important examples. And it gets installed to the local app data folder, and we actually create programs and programs files common on demand when you install a per-user application. And we've increased the set of Windows shell registrations to support the per-user context. Some of those, it's not limited to this list, but we have app paths, preview handlers, and autoplay handlers, in addition to the other things that were done in Windows Vista to allow per-user extension on the OS. So in the Windows installer, the features that we did is the first one, and we received a lot of feedback from this in Windows Vista. was that we wanted to allow you to create a single MSI package that installs both per user and per machine with sort of a similar experience to what you had previously with the Windows installer. And I'll give you a demonstration of that a little bit later. Elevation is only required for per machine installs, so only if the user clicks on the Install for Everyone button will they actually get an elevation prompt. Otherwise, they won't get elevation. And similar to how we handle 64-bit packages, we do automatic redirection in the background. So you don't have to author your package in such a way that it installs per user. You just have to say, you just have to mark it and say, my package supports per user, and you have to do the appropriate UI pieces. But realistically, behind the scenes, when you say target program files folder, if it's installing in per user mode, we'll redirect it to the per user program files folder. The registry keys will go ahead and redirect to the appropriate location, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have to do a lot of work in your package to work with this functionality. And finally, we're providing a set of ICE validations to sort of verify the correctness of your package for per user installation. Make sure that you have things marked correctly. Make sure that you're not using machine-wide locations that aren't automatically redirected, things like that. So building a per user MSI package. So how you identify a package as per user capable is you set two properties in your MSI package. You set the all users property to 2, and you set the MSI install per user property to 1. And that essentially tells the Windows installer, okay, with these two properties set, this package is authored for the Windows 7 per user experience. You have to make sure to use redirectable folders. Again, this isn't an exhaustive list. Common files and program files, there's a list of, say, 10 or 15 folders in the SDK that we actually do go ahead and redirect, and you can get that documentation from our SDK. You ensure that any of your application configuration data, and this is an important one, you ensure that your application configuration data is actually stored somewhere that can be accessible without elevating. This is a thing that most people are already doing because they didn't want their application to require elevation, but it's just something important to point out that you don't want to store your configuration data in a machine-wide location. You want to store it in the user's profile. You want to use redirectable registry keys, so you're going to use HK current user, or if you're the root in the registry table is -1, 0, or 1, and that'll be in a redirectable hive at that point. And in that case, then we'll redirect those things as appropriate. And again, only use per user capable registrations on the system and custom actions. So there are things like services that I mentioned before that you don't really want to install per user and stuff. So you need to be aware of those things that you can and can't do. And custom actions are also a big one, right? Since we're installing per user, those custom actions aren't going to get elevated. So make sure any custom action code that you have doesn't require elevation. Even with all the changes that we sort of made, per user deployment isn't for everyone. So it's important to point out, some of the things that, when you're thinking about per user deployment, you might look at this and say, oh, this is great. I don't want UAC prompts. I want to definitely install my application per user. There's a few things that you need to consider. The first one is that there are some OS registration points that are quite important that per user applications don't support yet. So the set program access and computer defaults and the default programs are things that are not per user supportable yet. So for example, if your application is a type of application where it's important to configure it from those control panels in Windows, then it's not appropriate for per user deployment. Additionally, if you have machine-wide prerequisites, say like the .NET framework or something like that, you'll need to figure out, well, what's your scheme for sort of deploying these machine-wide prerequisites? If you're a line of business app or an app that's normally corporate deployed, maybe that's not a particularly bad scenario because you can ensure that these prerequisites are deployed before your per-user application. But for consumer scenarios, that'll be harder to work because then you sort of lose the benefits of the per-user install if you have to install some sort of machine-wide prerequisites. So you need to think about that. One of the nice things is since per-user is on Windows 7, you can assume that most of those prerequisites are already going to be included on the OS that you probably need access to. Again, I mentioned previously that your package can't install components that require elevation, such as services, drivers, et cetera, et cetera. And the final point is actually pretty important. Since per-user apps are kind of a new thing, most of the auto-update mechanisms that are available don't really handle per-user applications particularly well. One of the interesting challenges with per-user applications is you can only patch it when the user's profile is loaded, which means that the user has to be logged on to the system. So that's a different patch scenario than you have today, where you can sort of scan the system for all the applications that are on the machine and patch them all at the same time. With per-user applications, the user has to be logged in to actually patch that application. So let me go ahead and show you a demo. I've received feedback previously that I should use real tools that people are using. The nice people over at InstallShield actually have already started working on support for some of our Windows 7 features. And I'm going to go ahead and show InstallShield and the support that they've built in for supporting per-user applications. Now, this is an early alpha release, but you should probably see it in beta sometime early next year. Let me get rid of my Animal Kingdom that doesn't work. And actually, oh, I didn't think about this. But we'll see what happens. I have to reboot my machine to get it out of this work state where it thinks another application's running, or another installation is running. But let's see what happens. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new project in InstallShield. And I'm going to go ahead and you all are familiar with this if you've used InstallShield before. I'm going to go ahead and go through the project designer that they have. Now, one of the new things they've added here is this functionality. It says, would you like to allow your end users to install your per-user installation? If I go ahead and click yes on here, it's going to do all the things that are necessary to make my package sort of per-user capable. And I'm just going to go ahead and where are we at? System 32. I'll go ahead and add Notepad, because that's always the great demo application to install, right? Let me go ahead and build an installation. And I will open up the package here, and I will cross my fingers that I don't get the same problem that I had previously. So you can go ahead and see that there's this new dialog here. It says install for anybody who uses this computer or only for me. So if I go ahead and I hit only for me, I'm going to get that same problem that I had before. That's supposed to be, but you know, I'm running this on Windows 7, so it can have a little bit of a challenge. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and reboot this machine and then continue with my talk, and then I'll come back to this and see if I can get it working correctly. All right. So kind of takeaways over from the talk. You know, the first thing is that you can use the Windows Installer 4.5 again. You should look at that today for sort of improving your experiences. Windows 7, we sort of have additional sort of for free out-of-the-box improvements that we have for application deployment. You know, there's improved performance reliability, many dependencies that you might have, whether it be the .NET Framework or the Windows installer. They're in the box, so you don't have to worry about redistributing those. And again, there's sort of minimal application compatibility impact. So you probably shouldn't have to worry about app compat on Windows 7, say that you did, say, in Windows Vista. And per-user application deployments on Windows 7 can really make it easier for users to install and sort of make a safer experience for them. So some resources that I have available here. Many of you familiar with the Windows Installer blog at all? Anybody? Anybody? Surprising. I talk about it at every show, but not a lot of people go visit it yet. We actually haven't had a lot of updates to it lately, but one of the things we did during the 4.5 release is we posted a lot of topics from our developers about the new features we have in 4.5, how you want to go ahead and use those, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to do the same thing for Windows 7. So you're going to see a series of blog posts about Windows 7. One second here. You're going to see a series of blog posts, say, about Windows 7 and you know, how to use the various features and stuff from our developers. We do read your comments on the blog, so that's really a good place for you to sort of give us feedback about either the features that we're working on today or what you'd like to see in the Windows installer in the future. So I highly encourage people to go ahead and use that. And that's blogs.msdn.com/Windows_installer_team if you can't see that there. And then there's also the Windows Installer Start page on MSDN. That's obviously where our documentation is. The Windows 7 documentation is not published yet. It won't be published until the beta is available. But as I mentioned, we're going to start posting a series of articles on our blog that will give you the same, actually probably deeper information than what's available in the Windows 7 documentation. So stay tuned to our blog for that information. I've got a link here to the Windows Installer 4.5 redistributable. Again, that's available for download off the Download Center. The 4.5 SDK is also available for download off the Download Center. And there's also a link to the ClickOnce documentation on MSDN. And finally, the Client Profile Configuration Designer, the beta that's available today, is available from windowsclient.net/WPF. Finally, evaluations. So I actually do read your evaluations, and I greatly appreciate them, and that's why I brought the Mountain Dew. But please, provide your evaluations. It really helps me sort of improve my presentations that I'm giving, making sure I'm giving people the information that they want and that they're looking for out of these sessions. And I do also read the free-form feedback. So please provide feedback on the session. Let me go ahead here and see how my machine's doing. And then I will go ahead and try to run through the per-user demo. In the meantime, questions. So there is a microphone there. So if you have questions, try to be nice to me as possible. And I'll also get the demo up here running in a second. So you have a question?
Yeah. Is there anything new in the realm of silent installations?
In the realm of what?
Silent installations?
Oh, silent installations? No, there's nothing new in the realm of silent installations. Was there something specific that you were thinking about, or?
Well, I mean, specifically, you mentioned the need for a bootstrapper.
Yep.
And typically for silent installations, that's
the bad scenario.
Right, that's the way to go. So,
so in that case, actually, there is kind of something new. I mentioned that you can use the embedded UI functionality to do what you would normally do from your bootstrapper code. And the nice thing about the embedded UI is it respects all of our silent switches and things like that. So you can actually write in your embedded UI code that says, hey, if it's silent, do the actions that manage the transaction, but don't actually throw the UI pieces. So you can actually do that from your embedded UI code. So that makes it especially easier for, say, system administrators trying to deploy the MSI package. They just have to deploy the MSI package and not have to worry about figuring out how to figure out what the setup.exe is doing. So that's, it's not specifically about silent installations, but getting rid of these setup.exe bootstrappers and some of the stuff we've done with MSI 4.5 really allows you to improve that experience.
Thank you.
Sure, no problem.
Yeah, you mentioned that there's some improvements to the lock permissions. Can you tell us what some of those are and where they came from, and if you're keeping up on all the latest patches coming into like Wix?
I'm not keeping up on all the latest patches that are. You mean, so Wix has their own lock permissions
they have the
implementation.
permission X element.
If your question is, does our lock permission support do everything that Wix does? The answer is no. Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have the complete list. I know there are things that like lock permissions didn't support previously, like CSIDs and stuff like that. It didn't support stuff. You had to explicitly say, which accounts had which access to which things. There wasn't a way to sort of inherit permissions and things like that. So we did add support for that in our lock permissions table, but there's still stuff that Wix does that our lock permissions table does not do. But what we wanted to sort of target was sort of the low-hanging fruit and say, well, what are the things that most people need out of lock permission support? So yeah, there still are going to be cases where you're going to have sort of custom action code for some more advanced lock permissions functionality. But ideally, what we have in the lock permissions table is going to meet the needs of most people. I think one of the other things you said is sort of, are we keeping up with all the changes? And that's a good question going forward that we need to think about. So after Windows 7, is the right thing for the Windows installer for us to continue to build stuff into the platform? And are we actually going to be able to keep up with that? Or is the right thing for us to make it safer and easier for people to write the appropriate custom action code to extend the system? And that's something we need to think about moving forward that I don't really have an answer for yet. But just off the top of my head, and being involved with this technology for a long time, it's very difficult for an OS technology like the Windows installer to keep up with all of the changes around it in such a way that people will never have to write custom actions. So it seems like one of the best things that we can do is really enhance the custom action architecture in such a way so that it's we provide the appropriate guidance to people and the appropriate infrastructure to write good custom actions like the ones that exist in Wix.
Okay. And then a quick question. For the elevation prompt on uninstall, does that work even if you use embedded cabs that get stripped and the digital signature becomes invalidated on the cached package?
So that's actually part of the reason why it wasn't displayed properly. And yes.
Okay.
It does.
Do you just keep it elsewhere? You say, yeah, we trust it?
There is, I do not know the specific details of it. I know my lead developer yells at me when I say we keep the cabs around because she says, no, that's not actually what we do. We perform all sorts of other magic. But it was something that people came to us for Vista SP1 and said, why don't you fix this in Vista SP1? And literally, like, the architectural and security work that had to be done to get this to work correctly was a tremendous amount of work, which is why it appeared in Windows 7.
Okay.
Thanks.
For Windows 7, how different are the ICE validations going to be from the way they are today in Vista?
That's a good question. I had at the end of my tech ed talk a list of kind of additional sort of bugs and things that were fixed in addition to new features. And I didn't do that for this talk today. And I know there were some changes that were made in Windows Installer 4.5 for the ICE validators that were fixing sort of known bugs and errors that we had in them. And in Windows 7, I think we've made minimal changes. I think the most changes that you're going to see is the set of new validators for per-user applications, but there's not a whole lot of changes to sort of the currently existing validators. I know we've had, I don't recall what it was. I know there's like 2 or 3 validators we fixed, and the primary problem was that they were displaying errors when really it's not really an error, it's more of a warning. It's kind of error should be something that if you run into it, then it's something that you have to fix, versus a warning is something that's kind of a gray area thing that says, hey, it may be the right thing, it may be the wrong thing. So we did move some things from errors to warnings, but I don't recall exactly what those things are. But that's a good question, and I should make sure that we have a blog posting about that sometime over the next few months that we can sort of detail what are the changes that were made in those.
Okay. One more question. I understand there's a demand for single user or one user installation, but some applications require full machine installations and want to force the all user condition.
Yep.
And setting all _ users in your installs is not a recommended method, I guess you could say. What are you doing for those of us that only do all user or all machine distributions?
Is there like some specific?
If your app licensing basically says this is must be rolled out as a group policy to the computer and not as a per user install via group policy pushing the apps down, or when the user just installs it, it installs on all users, not just single user.
Okay, I see what you're saying. There's no real changes that we've made there. It's an interesting, I might want to talk to you a little bit more about it after the show, because I need to understand the scenario a little bit more.
Well, our licensing is per system.
Yeah.
And we don't want just a single user of a machine installing it.
You just don't want to allow people to do that, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so there's no restrictions that we have in place for that. It's something interesting that you bring up, because I haven't heard that from people before. But it might be something that, either there's something that we can set in the package, or some policy that we can set, or something like that keeps that from happening. But licensing is a common thing that we hear from people about. Are you going to build stuff into the Windows installer that sort of helps enforce licensing, or keeps people from having the right custom actions to handle those scenarios? And that's something that we're definitely looking at, but there's nothing in Windows 7 that we've done.
All right, thanks.
Sure, no problem. I got my demo working. So let me go ahead and show this to you really quick. So if I go ahead, I've just gone ahead and finished up at the point where I was previously. So I just finished installing the per-user version of this application. And if I go to If I go to local app data, you can see that there's a programs directory under local app data, and there's my company name, my product name, and there's my version of Notepad down there. And I can go ahead and, just like when I installed the application, I can go ahead and uninstall it, and you'll see that there's not going to be any UAC prompt for uninstalling the application. And I go back and it's not there anymore. I can go ahead and run the install again. And I can go ahead and install it for all users on this computer. You see I do get a UAC prompt. It's a scary one because I didn't sign it. And instead of installing to the local app data, it actually goes ahead and installs to program files, where you see, where's my company name? Here we go. You can see that it goes ahead and installs Notepad there in that location. And then, of course, when I go ahead and I uninstall it, I'm going to go ahead and get the UAC prompt. So again, this is very nice because I didn't have to do a whole lot to create this package. It was just sort of handled behind the scenes for me by InstallShield. Even if I wasn't using InstallShield or I was using a regular authoring tool, it's just setting a few properties and making that UI work with the Shield. That really gives users that options, but then sort of everything else is sort of handled behind the scenes for you. So it's a very nice, compelling feature for a lot of people.
Tyler, is that aware that the user does or doesn't have admin rights? If they don't have admin rights, will it disable that button for all users?
Oh yeah, so the question is that's a very good question actually. We got that a lot during Vista. The question is it aware that if the user doesn't have admin rights? So one of the interesting things is there's really no good way to know if the user doesn't have admin rights, because even if I'm logged in as a non-admin user on the system, I always have the ability to do over-the-shoulder elevation on the system. So I could always have the admin password or have the admin come over and type the password for me. So we did get a lot of people who requested and said, well, I don't even want to have that UI. I just want to have it function one way if the user is an admin and another way if the user is not. But what we really found with doing a lot of research with the security group on this is there's no good way to determine that you're never going to know if the user has admin rights or not until that UAC prompt is presented and until it's responded to. So that's the best way to know that. Now, of course, you can always check explicitly if the user is logged in as admin or with admin credentials, but that will leave out the over-the-shoulder elevation scenario that might occur. Got a question?
It's a question. Today, the OEM Ready program actually restricted the location where you can put your EXE as a OEM pre-installation manner. So for the per-user installation, when you the path here, I think is under user data, right?
Yeah, local app data, huh?
Local data. So is that compliant with the OEM Ready requirements?
So the OEM Ready requirements, that's funny. It's the second time I've heard that question. I need to check and see with that. I know I need to have, I have them, they sent me an email before I came out to the show and said I need to get together and review the requirements with them. But I think that's something that we need to make sure that it's compliant with the OEM Ready requirements by the time Windows 7 comes out.
Yeah, probably they have to change.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely, yeah. So the requirements have to change because this is something that is a standard location for Windows. It's a Windows-wide thing. So we'll make sure that that's addressed appropriately in the requirements, and also logo requirements and other things as well.
Thanks.
I noticed that it defaults to local app data. So what's the roaming experience for a user, and especially sort of like a follow-up to that? So roaming across bitness, so 64-bit, 32-bit, and then Itanium was also 64-bit. So what would I, as a user, expect when I go from one machine to the next after installing a per machine on one? Obviously, the bits are going to be in one place, but then there's going to be all the MSI hookups in the roaming parts as well. So is it just going to default to the standard source resiliency that's happening right now?
That's a good question, and I do not know the answer to that. There's one question I had not prepared for, and I didn't talk to the PM specifically about the roaming experience for per-user applications. I'll have to ask her about that when we get back. I would hope we're doing the right thing. I would hope there's not even, even the resiliency experience would be a little bit odd because you might not have access to the original package.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah,
is it going to change?
So I should, One of the interesting things is that I was not involved with the per user stuff very early on in the design phases, so I wasn't privy to a lot of the design discussions. I know that like our lead developer that has been on the Windows installer for many, many, many years was one of the lead people heading this up. So that's why I can relatively confidently say that we're going to do the right thing with not a disruptive experience for the user, but I don't know precisely what that experience is. Okay. So I'll have to find out about that.
Can you get her to post onto the blog?
I think I should. I think I'll have to find out about it and put it on the blog because I think we should have something about the experience there. So, okay. Thanks.
Hi. I just started looking into the 4.5 engine. Is there a single engine that I can download and install to all the operating system, or I have to do?
I took out that slide. Unfortunately, it's actually not a single engine you can install to all the OSs. I think there's 5 different packages that you have to manage. There's MSU files for Vista and Windows Server 2008, and then there's exe packages for down level. So you'll have to actually, there's actually a blog posting if you go to our blog that actually outlines that and details that, but it's all available from the download center. We're actually out of time. I've actually gone over, so I should go ahead and get torn down here. But if you have more questions for me, go ahead and come chat with me. I'll just hang out in the hallway or something afterwards. But thanks a lot for coming today, and don't forget to fill out the evaluations. Thanks.